August 9th, 1945. 72 hours have passed since the sky over Hiroshima fell to earth. Picture a doctor. His name is Terufumi Sasaki. He is 25 years old, but his face is the mask of an old man carved from gray ash and frozen despair. He stands in the middle of what was once the inner courtyard of the Red Cross hospital. His white coat is now a shroud, stiff with dried blood and grime, black with the soot that still falls from the sky like a fine, oily rain. He has not slept for 3 days. Sleep is a luxury the sky has stolen. Around him, as far as the eye can see, lies a field of human bodies. Not dead. Worse. They are still alive. Thousands, perhaps 10,000 mutilated, burned, dying people. They stir like a disturbed anthill. They moan, and this moan merges into a single, low, endless hum, like the drone of severed wires. It is the soundtrack to the end of the world. Doctor. Sasaki cannot feel his legs. His hands move mechanically, almost independent of his will. In his eyes there is no fear, no pity, not even exhaustion. There is only emptiness, a soul scorched to a barren wasteland. He has just made a decision that has forever burned the man out of him and turned him into a function, a merciless instrument of survival. He has divided all these people into 2 categories, those who might survive and those who will surely die. For the second group, he has no more water, no more bandages, no more time. He simply walks past them, not looking into their pleading eyes, hearing their whispers. Mizu, water. He is the only uninjured doctor for this armada of suffering. He is both the god and the executioner of this man-made hell. His universe has shrunk to the size of this courtyard, and his Hippocratic oath has melted away, transforming into a single question he repeats to himself like a mantra. Who's next? But to understand how this young, idealistic surgeon became this gray ghost sorting through death, we must go back 96 hours to the last morning of the world he knew, to the moment the sun rose over Hiroshima for the last time. August 6th, 1945. The air of Hiroshima was thick and humid, like warm milk. The summer day promised to be unbearably hot. The city was waking up slowly, lazily, to the chirping of cicadas and the distant whistles of steamships in the port. For Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, this morning began like hundreds of others before it. He woke long before dawn in his small room at the Red Cross hospital, where he not only worked but also lived, dedicating his entire self to medicine. He was 25, obsessed with his work with the fanaticism of a zealot. He was a surgeon, and in these wartime years, his hands were a precious commodity. He performed his usual morning rituals: a quick cold shower to chase away the last vestiges of sleep, a cup of weak tea, and a review of the case files of the patients he was scheduled to operate on today. His thoughts were clear and orderly, like the instruments on a surgical tray. The war was happening somewhere far away. Yes, there were air raid sirens. Yes, the city was prepared for bombing. But Hiroshima had so far remained untouched. A belief circulated among the residents that the Americans were sparing their city because many of their relatives who had once immigrated to the USA lived here. A foolish, naive hope, but people clung to it like a drowning man to a straw. Dr. Sasaki did not believe these rumors. He was a man of science, a pragmatist to the bone, but even he felt that strange, almost unnatural calm hanging over the city. As he drank his tea, his gaze fell on a photograph on his desk. His fiancée, Hanako, smiled from it. They were to be married in the autumn, after the rice was harvested from the fields. He thought of her laugh, of how her hands would look in their new home. These thoughts were his private, sacred refuge from the horrors of war he saw every day on the operating table. By 7:30 in the morning he was already on his rounds. The hospital was living its usual life. The smell of antiseptics, the quiet conversations of nurses, the muffled groans from the wards. Everything was as always. He did not yet know that the very concept of as always would vanish from the universe in an hour. The air raid alert that had sounded early in the morning had already been cancelled. Only a single reconnaissance plane had been spotted over the city, and no one paid it any mind. A common occurrence. Life went on. 8 o'clock in the morning was approaching. Dr. Sasaki finished his rounds and headed to his third-floor office to prepare for the first operation. He walked down the long corridor, contemplating a difficult case of peritonitis in an elderly patient. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. He passed wards where patients slept, walked past the nurse's station where a nurse was diligently writing in a logbook. He was just a few steps from his office when he decided to pause for a second at a window. Outside the window, his city stretched out, bathed in the bright morning sun. He saw the rooftops, the green of the distant hills, and heard the familiar noise of the street. Everything breathed peace and tranquility. He looked at his watch. 8:14. He thought he should hurry. At that moment, he didn't know that this second of hesitation at the window, this random glance at the city, would save his life. But he also didn't know that the salvation of his body would mean the death of his soul. 8:15 in the morning. The world vanished. There was no sound, no bang, no scream. There was only light. A merciless, unearthly, absolute white light that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns in a single instant. It didn't blind. It erased vision, searing the very essence of the world from within. Terufumi Sasaki didn't even have time to cry out. His body betrayed him, his instincts proving too slow for the apocalypse. He felt an unknown force throw him, not like a blow, but like a distortion of space itself. The thick, reinforced concrete walls of the corridor, which were supposed to protect against conventional bombs, shuddered like a house of cards. The window where he had just been standing exploded inward into 1,000,000 sparkling needles. He was shielded by a bend in the corridor, but even here he was thrown to the floor with such force that the air was knocked from his lungs. And then came the sound. A sound for which there is no name in human language. It was not a roar. It was the shriek of the universe being torn apart. It seemed as if the very atoms of the air were screaming in unbearable pain. The hospital building groaned like a dying leviathan. Plaster rained from the ceiling, walls cracked, and somewhere, with a heart-wrenching screech, floors collapsed. And then came darkness. An absolute, impenetrable darkness, filled with dust that clogged his nose and mouth and scratched at his eyes. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Terufumi lay on the floor, deafened, blinded, unsure if he was alive or dead. A thin, high-pitched ringing filled his ears. He tried to move. His body ached, but it seemed nothing was broken. He quickly professionally patted himself down. There was no blood, only numerous small cuts from glass shards. His glasses had flown off and he crawled on the floor, fumbling in the dust until he found them. One lens was cracked, but they were intact. He put them on and tried to stand. The darkness was not complete. Through the dusty haze, a strange crimson light filtered through. Gradually, sounds began to return to him, but they were not the sounds of life. They were screams, moans, weeping. They came from everywhere, from behind walls, from under the rubble, from the street. He stumbled down the corridor, which had become a cave littered with debris. Part of the roof had collapsed, revealing the sky. Not blue, but a dirty yellow, veiled in smoke and dust. He reached the place where his office should have been. The outer wall was simply gone. The wind howled through the ruins, rustling scraps of paper. Everything that had been in the office, his desk, his books, his instruments, the photograph of Hanako, had vanished, vaporized. He looked down at the city, and in that moment, the cold, rational mind of Dr. Terufumi Sasaki refused to believe his eyes. The city was gone. Where houses had stood just a minute ago, a sea of fire now raged. Everything was burning. The horizon was obscured by a gigantic, mushroom-shaped cloud of dust and smoke that swelled, billowed, and shimmered with ghastly orange and purple hues. He was standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the heart of the apocalypse. His first thought was not of Hanako, not of his family. His first thought was, the patients. He turned and ran back, deep into the ruined building. The screams grew louder. He realized he had survived by a near miracle, protected by the mass of concrete. He realized that most of his colleagues and the nurses, who had been in less protected rooms, were likely dead or severely injured. He realized that the entire pain of this shattered world was about to fall upon his shoulders. And in that moment, he understood. If he wanted to save anyone, he had to forget he was a man. He had to become a surgeon for a dying city, without emotion, without fear, without hope. Emerging from the trap of the corridor, Dr. Sasaki found himself in a world that had stepped out of the pages of Buddhist sutras describing hell. The hospital, which just half an hour ago had been a bastion of order and cleanliness, had turned into smoldering ruins filled with the screams of the agonizing. He made his way through the rubble, stepping over bodies. Some were dead, crushed by fallen beams. Others were alive, but their injuries were so horrific that the doctor's mind momentarily refused to process them. He saw a nurse he knew, impaled to the floor by a rebar, looking at him and weeping silently. He saw the chief physician lying with his head crushed. Everywhere there was fire, smoke, and panic. Surviving patients and staff, those who could move, scrambled through the corridors, mad with fear and pain, trying to find a way out. Terufumi tried to stop them, to give first aid, but no one listened. The chaos was absolute. His instinct led him to the pharmacy and the dressing room. He had to get medicine, bandages, anything that had survived. On the way, he tore off the remains of his coat and wrapped it around his face to protect himself from the acrid smoke. Reaching the pharmacy proved almost impossible. The stairwells were destroyed. He had to somehow climb down over the debris, risking a fall at every second. Finally, he reached the first floor. Here, the scene was even more terrifying. The main hall was blocked, but through breaches in the walls, he saw what was happening outside, and it was a sight for which no human being was prepared. Streams of people were heading toward the hospital, as if to a final island of hope. They came from the burning city, from the very heart of the firestorm. But they were not quite people. They looked like shadows, like ghosts. They walked in silence, in their thousands, forming strange, endless processions. Their clothes had been turned to rags, and many had no clothes at all. Their skin, it hung in tatters like wet paper. Their faces were swollen and unrecognizable. They walked with their arms outstretched before them to avoid their burned bodies touching one another. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just walked, their movements slow and mechanical. These were the living corpses, the hibakusha, born of a new, unknown war. They came to the hospital because a hospital is a place that helps. There were hundreds of them, then thousands. They filled the courtyard, the garden. They climbed through windows. They lay down on the ground, dying where they fell. Dr. Sasaki watched this procession of the damned, and an icy horror seized him. Not fear for his own life. It was the metaphysical horror of a doctor witnessing an illness the size of a city. He realized that all his education, all his knowledge, all of modern medicine, was nothing in the face of this. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of an absolute, unprecedented scale. He was alone. One doctor for thousands of the dying. He finally broke through to what was left of the pharmacy. Most of the cabinets were overturned, vials shattered, everything covered in a layer of dust and soot. But some things had survived. He found a few packs of bandages, a bottle of iodine, a little burn ointment, and most importantly, a large jar of table salt. Salt. He immediately thought of a saline solution to combat dehydration from burns. It was something. He found a few other surviving nurses as dazed and terrified as he was. He didn't shout at them, didn't give orders. He just said in a firm, calm voice, "They need us. Follow me. Find water. Any water. And bring it here." He went out into the courtyard, into this boiling cauldron of suffering. Dozens of hands immediately reached for him. A crowd surrounded him, their faces turned to him with a final, desperate plea. It seemed they would devour him, tear him apart in their desperation. But it was at this moment that something switched inside Dr. Sasaki. He ceased to be Terufumi, Hanako's fiancé, his parents' son. He became the doctor. He raised a hand and spoke as loudly as he could. "Everyone sit down. I will help each of you, but you must maintain order." And to his surprise, they obeyed. A relative quiet fell, broken only by moans. He realized he was the only point of order in this world of total chaos. He was their last hope, and that hope was so minuscule it was almost a mockery. He had only a few hours left to breathe before this sea of pain consumed him. The first few hours became a test of endurance for Dr. Sasaki, a trial beyond the limits of human capability. His brain, trained by years of study, operated with the cold efficiency of a machine. He instantly realized that trying to provide comprehensive care in such conditions was madness that would only lead to the swift depletion of his meager resources and strength. A system was needed. A primitive, brutal system, but a system nonetheless. He found 2 surviving nurses, Kiyoshi and Akiko, and an elderly orderly. They were in shock, but his calm confidence had a sobering effect on them. His first order was simple. "Water and salt. We need saline solution. A huge amount." In the hospital kitchen, a massive rice-cooking cauldron had miraculously survived. The orderly, risking his life, started a fire under it with broken furniture. The nurses and a few lightly wounded volunteers began to search for water. The water main was broken. They collected rainwater running off the roofs, scooped water from a decorative pond in the garden where dead fish were already floating. Any water would do. The fire would have to sterilize it. Dr. Sasaki himself took on the main task, triage or medical sorting. It is the most terrible thing a doctor can do. It is the process where you decide who is worthy of help and who is doomed. He divided the courtyard into 3 zones. The first, closest to the improvised aid station, was for those with serious but not fatal burns and injuries. These were his priority patients. The second zone, farther away, was for the lightly wounded, those who could care for themselves or even help others. The third zone, the farthest by the garden wall, became the zone for the dying. He ordered those with burns over 90% of their bodies, penetrating wounds to the abdomen and chest, and anyone unconscious to be taken there. He had neither the ability nor the resources to perform complex surgeries. To spend an hour on one hopeless case meant condemning 10 who could be saved to death. He walked from one body to another, his gaze quick and appraising. He didn't look into their eyes. He looked at their trauma. "Here," he would snap to the volunteers, pointing to the first zone. "There." His voice was flat as he sent another person off to die. People cried, begged, grabbed his hands. He did not react. He had become a mechanism. His sole thought was to save the maximum number of lives, even at the cost of his own humanity. When the saline solution was ready, the assembly line began. Dr. Sasaki applied quick dressings, using bedsheets torn into strips, which the nurses soaked in the solution instead of bandages. It was primitive, but it helped to clean the wounds and prevent dehydration. He worked without stopping. His hands flew. Smear the burn, bandage it, give them the solution to drink. Next. Smear, bandage, drink. Next. Hour after hour. He felt no hunger, no thirst, no fatigue. Adrenaline and a sense of duty were burning him from the inside. He was in a state resembling a combat trance. The world around him ceased to exist. There were only wounds and his hands. But then he began to notice something strange. People were brought to him with no visible injuries. They looked almost healthy, just very weak. But after a few hours they would start vomiting, their temperature would rise, and then they would die in agony. He examined them and could find no cause. None of his knowledge could explain these symptoms. He was treating burns, but people were dying of something else, of some unknown plague. Strange purple spots appeared on their skin. Their gums began to bleed. Their hair fell out in clumps. He stood before the body of a young girl who had only complained of nausea that morning and was now dead, and he realized with horror he was fighting an enemy he could neither see nor understand. His secret weapon, his medical knowledge, was almost useless. He was treating the symptoms of a disease whose nature he could not even imagine. It was radiation sickness. But in 1945, that term meant nothing to a practicing physician. He understood that his battle was lost before it had even begun. The first 24 hours passed. Day turned into night, but for Terufumi Sasaki, time had merged into one endless, viscous nightmare. The night brought no relief. The city continued to burn, and the glow of the fires painted the sky a blood-red color, turning the hospital ruins into the set of a Shakespearean tragedy. Under this ghastly light, his work continued. The number of wounded did not decrease. They kept arriving, crawling out of the darkness, hoping for a miracle. By the morning of the second day, his empire of ash had taken on clear outlines. He was its undisputed and sole ruler. His word was law because it was the only thing separating the survivors from total chaos. He organized a system of shifts for his few assistants. Those who were lightly wounded but could walk became his orderlies. Their task was to bring water and to remove the dead, taking them to a separate area to prevent an epidemic. He established brutal rules. Water and food, if anything could be found in the kitchen ruins, were distributed strictly according to his instructions. Priority was given to the workers and to the wounded, who had a chance. For attempting to steal a sip of water or a piece of biscuit, he threatened immediate expulsion from the camp, which was tantamount to a death sentence. He became a dictator, a tyrant, but his tyranny was the only way to save anyone. People obeyed because in his cold eyes and firm voice they saw not cruelty but order. He was their rock, their anchor in this trembling world. He created a daily routine. In the morning, rounds and triage of the newly arrived. During the day, changing dressings. In the evening, rounds again to check on the severely wounded. At night, he barely slept, continuing to help those in pain. He gave them not so much medicine, of which there was almost none left, but his presence, his calm word. He became not just a doctor, but a priest, a psychologist, and a judge. He taught his volunteer assistants the basics of medicine, how to apply a primitive bandage, how to recognize dehydration, how to determine if a person was dead and not just unconscious. His small state lived by the laws of a state of emergency, and this system, this island of order in the midst of hell, gave people something more important than bandages and water. It gave them the feeling that their lives were still being fought for, that they were not just abandoned to die. It gave them hope, a fragile, ghostly hope. Dr. Sasaki watched how people changed. Yesterday's ordinary citizens, frightened and weeping, today became his loyal assistants. A young girl who was afraid of the sight of blood now cleaned festering wounds without flinching. An old man who had lost his entire family found a new meaning in life by carrying water for the wounded. They all became part of his mechanism, his army fighting against death. But he himself paid a terrible price for this. Every decision, every death sentence he pronounced left a deep scar on his soul. He felt less and less, acting more and more. His face became a motionless mask. He stopped calling patients by name. To him, they were just shoulder burn, leg wound, concussion. It was a defense mechanism, armor he had forged to keep from going mad with compassion. On the second day, his system reached its peak efficiency. He saved dozens, perhaps even hundreds of lives. He learned to predict the course of the unknown disease and to isolate those who showed its first signs. He was a genius of organization, born of chaos. But his triumph was short-lived. Resources were running out. The food was gone. There were almost no clean cloths for bandages. But the most terrifying thing, he ran out of iodine and other antiseptics. The wounds he had so carefully treated began to fester. The specter of gangrene and sepsis loomed over his empire. His system was perfect, but it was built on sand, and he knew that very soon it would all collapse. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of his new world. In the darkness of the courtyard, among the moaning bodies, a rebellion began to brew. By the end of the second day, the tension had reached its limit. People were exhausted not only physically, but mentally. Pain, hunger, thirst, and the constant presence of death were eating away at their souls like acid. And in this toxic atmosphere, someone was bound to emerge to challenge Dr. Sasaki's iron order. That person was a tall, strong man, a former shipyard worker. His injuries were not too serious, and he had been helping from the start. But in his eyes, the doctor saw not gratitude, but a hidden resentment. He was not a villain. He was the embodiment of despair. He saw Dr. Sasaki walk past the dying, saw him deny water to those he deemed hopeless. From the perspective of common sense, distorted by agony, the doctor's actions seemed monstrously cruel. The rebellion began with whispers. The worker started telling others that the doctor was hoarding food and water for himself and his favorites, that he was playing God, deciding who lived and who died, that they needed to take by force what was left and divide it equally among everyone. These words were like sparks falling on the dry tinder of collective despair. A few others supported him. They were united not so much by selfishness as by fear and a disbelief that help would ever come. They wanted their chance at survival here and now, even if it destroyed the fragile system the doctor had created. The confrontation happened at night. Dr. Sasaki was distributing the last of the boiled water. The worker with 3 other men approached him and blocked his path. "Enough, doctor," he rasped. "We're not going to watch you starve people anymore. Hand over all the water. We'll figure out how to divide it ourselves." Terufumi looked at them. He was not a warrior. He was a doctor. Physically, he was much weaker than them. But there was such an icy resolve in his gaze that they momentarily froze. "Step aside," he said quietly but with authority. "If you do this, there will be anarchy here in a few hours. The strong will take everything. The weak will die. And then the strong will die from pain and infection because there will be no one and nothing to treat them. You will kill everyone." "We're already dying," one of the rebels shouted. "You are dying, but you have order," Sasaki replied, not raising his voice. "You have a chance. Do you want to trade that chance for a single extra sip of water?" But words were no longer working. The worker stepped forward, and then Dr. Sasaki did something no one expected. He didn't resist. He simply held out the small bucket of water to the worker. "Take it," he said. "But know that this bucket doesn't just hold water. It holds the life of that boy with the burns, whom I promised to drink in an hour, and the life of that woman who has lost so much blood, and the life of the old man who helped you pull people from the rubble yesterday. Take it. Drink their lives." The worker froze, his hand outstretched. He looked at the bucket, then at the doctor, then at the hundreds of eyes watching them in the darkness. He saw in those eyes not support, but condemnation and fear. He realized that Dr. Sasaki had not handed him water but the responsibility for the deaths of others, and that burden was unbearable. He slowly lowered his hand. The rebellion was quashed, not by force, but by the force of spirit. Dr. Sasaki had defended his law. He was once again master of the situation. But while he dealt with the enemy within, fate was preparing its most terrible, most devastating blow. Just at that moment, when it seemed order had been restored, shouts were heard from the main gates. Several people were carrying someone toward him on a makeshift stretcher made from a door. Dr. Sasaki's heart plummeted with an icy weight. He knew that every new patient was another tragedy, but something was different this time. A premonition of disaster, sharp as a scalpel, stabbed into him. He walked toward the stretcher, pushing through the crowd. When he got closer and looked into the face of the woman lying on it, his world, already destroyed once, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. It was Hanako, his fiancée. He didn't recognize her at first. Her beautiful face was disfigured by burns. Her long black hair, which he had so admired, was singed away. But he recognized her by her eyes, even clouded by pain and shock. They were her eyes. She was conscious, but barely breathing. Her clothes were burned away, and on her body were not only horrific burns, but also those same sinister purple spots he had learned to recognize as the seal of death. Radiation sickness in its most acute stage. They had brought her from another part of the city. At the moment of the blast, she had been on the street, not far from the epicenter. The fact that she had survived for 2 days was already a miracle. The doctor in him made an instant diagnosis. 3rd-degree burns, radiation exposure, shock, dehydration. The prognosis was absolutely hopeless. But the man in him screamed in pain and denial. This couldn't be her. It had to be some monstrous mistake. The people who brought her looked at him with expectation. The entire courtyard fell silent, watching this mute scene. Everyone knew who she was. Their doctor, their god, their savior was facing his most terrible test, and they all waited to see what he would do. In that moment, Dr. Sasaki faced a choice that was worse than death. He had his last, most precious resources left. A few sterile bandages he had been saving for the most severe, but promising cases. The last ampule of morphine he had kept for the children. A small supply of clean water. His medical duty, his system, the laws of his empire that he himself had established with blood and sweat, demanded one thing: to take Hanako to the zone for the dying. Her chances were 0. To spend precious medicine on her meant taking it from those who could still be saved. It would be a betrayal to the hundreds of people who had entrusted their lives to him. But lying before him was not just a patient. Lying before him was his entire life, his entire future, everything that had meaning for him before the sky fell. His love, his Hanako. He looked at her ravaged face, and memories of her smile, her laugh, their plans for an autumn wedding flooded his mind. The Hippocratic oath collided with an oath of love, and it was a battle in which there could be no victor. He could violate his duty and try to ease his beloved's final hours using everything he had. It would be the human thing to do, but it would be an act that would cost others their lives. Or he could follow his iron rule. Be not a man, but a doctor. And with his own hands, carry his love to die in order to save strangers. It would be the act of a true hero. But it would be an act that would have finally killed the man inside him. He stood over her, and time stopped. The whole world, this entire hell, all these moaning people disappeared. There was only him and her. He knelt, took her hand. She opened her eyes, recognized him. Her chapped lips whispered his name. And in that moment, he made his choice. The decision Dr. Sasaki made was the quietest and most terrible moment of his life. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, looked at the orderlies who were waiting for his command, and nodded toward the first zone, the zone for those he was still fighting for. He had broken his own law. He gave her a chance she didn't have. He made a choice not as a doctor, but as a man. And in that same second he regretted it, because the doctor in him screamed that this was a betrayal. But it was too late. He carried her to a quiet corner, made her a semblance of a bed out of some rags. He used the last of the sterile bandages on her. He injected her with half the dose of morphine, saving the other half for later. He cleaned her burns with the last of the clean water. He sat beside her, held her hand, and talked and talked and talked. He lied to her. He told her that everything would be all right, that help was on the way, that they would get married in the autumn as planned. He built a ghostly world of the future for her, while her present faded with every breath. The other wounded watched this in silence. No one said a word of reproach. Perhaps they understood him. Perhaps they saw in his act not weakness, but a manifestation of the highest humanity in this inhuman world. Or perhaps they no longer cared. He spent several hours with her. These were hours stolen from other patients who needed him. He heard their groans but couldn't bring himself to leave Hanako's side. She was dying. As a doctor, he saw all the signs. Her breathing became shallow, her pulse thready. The morphine wore off and she began to moan in pain again. She looked at him, and in her eyes there was tenderness and pity. It seemed she pitied not herself, but him. She understood the agony he was going through. Her last words were a whisper. Live. And then she was gone. He sat beside her cooling body and something inside him broke. The string that had held him together, that had allowed him to remain strong, snapped with a dry crack. He did not cry. There were no tears. There was only a deafening, bottomless void. He had suffered a final, crushing defeat. He had not saved her. He had violated his duty, betrayed his patients, sacrificed everything, and it was all for nothing. He stood up. His movements were like an automaton's. He walked to the cauldron of saline solution, scooped up a cup, and went to another wounded person. He became the doctor again. But now, there was no fire in him, no hope, only cold ash. He worked until he was completely exhausted, until his legs could no longer hold him. He fell to his knees in the middle of the courtyard, in the middle of the bodies he had tried to save. He was broken. He was empty. He wanted to die. It was at this moment, when he had reached the very bottom of his personal hell, that he heard a new sound. It was not a moan, not a scream, not the crackle of fire. It was a steady, growing drone. The drone of truck engines. At first he thought it was a hallucination, but the sound grew louder. From behind the ruins, trucks with red crosses appeared. Help had arrived, a salvation that had arrived too late for his soul. The arrival of help was not like a scene from a heroic film. There were no joyful shouts, no tears of relief. The people who had lived for 3 days in hell had no energy left for emotions. They simply stared silently as military doctors and medics in clean uniforms jumped out of the trucks. The rescuers were shocked by what they saw. They had been prepared for destruction, but not for this scale of human suffering. And they were even more shocked when they saw the system organized by Dr. Sasaki. They saw the zones for the wounded, the cauldron of saline solution, the volunteers who continued to perform their duties even after reinforcements arrived. In the center of it all, they found a young doctor who looked like an old man. He was sitting on the ground, staring blankly at a single point. He did not respond to questions. His mind, which had held on at the breaking point for so long, had finally shut down. A senior military doctor, an experienced gray-haired colonel, approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, you did well. We'll take it from here. You need to rest." Terufumi slowly raised his eyes to him. There was nothing in them. "They're dying," he whispered. "They have spots. Their hair is falling out. I don't know what it is." The colonel looked at him intently, then at the wounded who were already being examined by his doctors. He saw the same symptoms. He didn't know what it was either, but he couldn't show his confusion. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "Now go. That's an order." Dr. Sasaki was led away, almost carried. His empire, his state of death and hope, ceased to exist. He was officially relieved. Salvation had turned into the loss of the one thing that had kept him afloat, his mission. The new doctors brought with them not only medicine but also bureaucracy. Registration of survivors began. Cards were filled out. Sasaki's feat, his superhuman efforts, his terrible decisions, all of it was being turned into lines in reports. He was interrogated. They asked him about the first hours, about what he saw, what he did. He answered mechanically, without emotion. He tried to explain to them about the unknown disease, but they looked at him with sympathy, as if at a man who had survived a severe psychological trauma. They didn't fully believe him. They attributed his words to shock and exhaustion. They didn't understand that he had witnessed the birth of a new era, the nuclear age. an era where diseases could be invisible and deadly. His rescue became his prison. He was surrounded by people but felt unbearably lonely. No one could understand what he had been through. He had survived hell, but hell had taken up residence inside him. He saw Hanako every time he closed his eyes. He heard the moans of the thousands of people he couldn't help. He had saved hundreds of lives but felt guilty for every single death. His victory had turned into a crushing defeat. His heroic story, worthy of an epic, was buried under tons of official papers, written off as part of the general chaos and confusion of the first days. The military tribunal of the system delivered its verdict. His feat was too irrational, too inconvenient for the official history. It did not fit into the framework of reports. He was just a doctor who did his duty under extraordinary circumstances. Nothing more, but nothing less. The fate of Dr. Terufumi Sasaki after the catastrophe is a quiet, almost invisible tragedy stretched over decades. He was never able to return to a normal life because the world he returned to seemed false and unreal after what he had seen. He did not leave medicine. On the contrary, he plunged into it with even greater fanaticism, as if trying to atone for some unknown guilt through his work. He dedicated the rest of his life to studying the effects of radiation. He became one of the world's leading specialists in radiation sickness. The unknown enemy he had faced in the ruins of the Red Cross Hospital became his life's work. He wanted to understand it, to study it, to find ways to fight it, so that no one would ever again find themselves as helpless as he had been. He worked in hospitals for the Hibakusha, the survivors of the bombing. He saw thousands of patients whose lives had been forever poisoned by an invisible venom. He treated them, eased their suffering, but each one was a living reminder of those 3 days. He never married. The memory of Hanako stayed with him forever. He could not forgive himself for her death, although his rational mind knew there was nothing he could have done. Guilt became his constant companion. He lived a very modest, almost ascetic life. He had no family, no children. His patients became his entire family, and his scientific papers became his children. He became a respected scientist, his name known in medical circles. But none of his new colleagues knew what lay behind his obsession with radiation medicine. He never spoke of what he had endured. He buried those memories as deep as he possibly could, but they came to him at night, in nightmares. Over and over he found himself in that smoldering courtyard, surrounded by thousands of dying people, making his terrible choice again. He died at an old age, in his bed, in silence and solitude. Quietly, unnoticed, just as he had lived all those years. The obituaries described him as a distinguished scientist who had made an enormous contribution to the study of the consequences of the nuclear catastrophe. No one wrote that in August of 45, this quiet old man had been both God and executioner to 10,000 people. No one wrote that with his own hands he had created an empire from the ashes and ruled it for 3 days until help arrived. His personal, incredible story of heroism and self-sacrifice was reduced to a dry line in medical statistics. The official history of Hiroshima is a story of numbers. 200,000 dead. So many thousands of tons of destroyed concrete. So many Roentgens of radiation. In these statistics, there is no room for the story of a single doctor who, for 3 days, became the center of a dying universe. His feat was too personal, too inconvenient, too terrifying to become part of the official chronicle. He was forgotten. But history has a way of sprouting, like grass through asphalt. It lives not in archives, but in the memory of people. Among the Hibakusha, the survivors of that hell, a legend circulated for a long time. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his story. But they passed down from one to another the tale of the young doctor from the Red Cross Hospital. It was said that he did not sleep for 3 days, that his hands never stopped, that his voice inspired hope in the dying. He was said to be as stern as the devil himself, but as just as a god. In this legend, his figure acquired almost mythical features. He became the nameless guardian angel who descended into hell to save souls. He became a symbol of the indomitable human spirit that continues to do its duty, even at the epicenter of the apocalypse. This story is not just a chronicle of events. It is a reminder that the greatest feats are not performed on battlefields under banners and the music of orchestras. They are performed in silence, in filth and despair. When one person makes the decision to remain human in the face of absolute evil. The story of Dr. Terufumi Sasaki is a question addressed to each of us. What are you willing to do to save another? Where is the line between heroism and cruelty, between duty and love? And what is left of a soul when you have survived where you should have perished? There are no answers to these questions. There is only the quiet legend of the doctor who survived in the ashes of Hiroshima, only to carry those ashes in his heart for the rest of his life.